The brush fell from Antonio's trembling fingers, its bristles still wet with celestial blue, as the bells of Santa Maria del Carmine struck the 13th hour, an hour that did not exist, an hour that rang only when souls prepared to step between worlds. The scaffolding creaked beneath his bare feet, and below him the half-finished fresco of the Virgin's Ascension gazed upward with eyes that had begun to weep tears of real gold, though Antonio had painted them with nothing but pigment and prayer. The Master's voice echoed from the chapel floor, demanding the completion of her divine face, but Antonio's hands had already forgotten the weight of earthly tools. Something in the painted Virgin's expression had shifted in the candlelight. Her lips had parted as if to speak a name he had heard whispered in dreams but never dared to voice in daylight. Wait, before the bells strike again. If this story already has your soul trembling, tell us where you're watching from. To walk with those who vanish into rain, who whisper psalms beneath the ruins, and who find freedom in silence, subscribe. And don't blink. Now, back to the scene. The year was 1847, and Florence held its breath beneath a sky that had forgotten how to rain. In the workshop of Master Lorenzo Benedetti, where saints bled gold and angels wept silver tears onto canvas, Antonio Fieramosca had learned to see beyond the veil of pigment and prayer. His fingers, stained permanent blue from grinding lapis lazuli, had traced the faces of martyrs until their suffering became his own. For 3 years, he had mixed colors that did not exist in nature, the precise shade of a soul in ecstasy, the exact hue of divine wrath. And with each passing season, he felt himself becoming less flesh and more vision. The commission for Santa Maria del Carmine had arrived on the feast day of St. Catherine, delivered by a nun whose face Antonio never saw clearly, though her voice remained burned into his memory like the whisper of silk against stone. The fresco was to depict the Virgin's Assumption, her body lifted toward heaven by invisible hands, her expression caught between earthly sorrow and celestial joy. Master Lorenzo had sketched the composition in charcoal, mapping every fold of divine drapery, every curl of ascending cloud. But when Antonio began to paint, something else emerged beneath his brush, something that made the master cross himself and mutter prayers in Latin he thought his apprentice could not understand. Antonio understood more than anyone suspected. The words that fell from the mouths of priests, the secrets whispered in confessionals, the names of angels called upon in desperate midnight hours, all of it lived in his blood like an inherited language. His grandmother had been burned for less, though the family spoke of it only in gestures and glances. She had painted icons that wept real tears, they said. She had given faces to visions that were meant to remain invisible. The gift, or curse, had skipped his father and settled in Antonio like a seed waiting for the proper season to bloom. The first sign had come when he painted the Virgin's hands. He had meant to capture the traditional gesture of acceptance, palms turned upward to receive divine grace. But when the paint dried, her fingers appeared to be reaching downward, beckoning to something or someone below. Master Lorenzo had demanded he paint them again, but each attempt yielded the same impossible result. The Virgin's hands refused to point toward heaven. They insisted on touching earth. "She reaches for the fallen," Antonio had whispered, not realizing he spoke aloud until Master Lorenzo's leather strap cracked against his shoulders. "Paint what is holy, boy, not what is heretical." But Antonio's brush would not obey earthly masters. As the weeks passed, the Virgin in the fresco began to take on features that belonged to no classical model, no idealized beauty from the master's collection of studies. Her face carried the angular cheekbones of Antonio's grandmother, the deep-set eyes that had seen too much, the mouth that could speak to saints and sinners with equal fluency. Master Lorenzo noticed, of course. His criticisms grew sharper, his supervision more constant. Yet he could not deny the power that radiated from the emerging figure. Pilgrims had begun to gather in the chapel before the work was even complete, drawn by reports of miracles, of tears shed by a painted face that had not yet received its final details. Antonio worked now only at night, long after Master Lorenzo had retreated to his bed above the workshop. The cathedral was never truly empty. Shadows moved between the pillars, and sometimes he heard voices singing hymns in harmonies that made his chest ache with longing. The scaffolding had become his private heaven, a place where he could commune with the figure taking shape beneath his hands without the weight of earthly expectations pressing against his shoulders. It was during one of these midnight vigils that she first spoke to him. "You paint what you remember, not what you see." Antonio's brush stilled against the wet plaster. The voice had come from the fresco itself, though the Virgin's mouth remained motionless. When he looked up at her face, her painted eyes seemed to hold depths that no mixture of pigment could achieve. "I remember nothing," he whispered back, though his voice cracked on the lie. "You remember the fire. You remember her face as the flames took her. You remember the way she smiled, even as they called her heretical." The brush fell from his fingers then, clattering against the wooden scaffold before dropping to the stone floor far below. The sound echoed through the empty cathedral like a bell struck in the wrong hour. Antonio pressed his back against the cold wall, his breathing sharp and shallow. "She was my grandmother," he said to the painted face that was no longer merely painted. "They said she could speak to saints. She could, and so can you." The admission hung between them like incense, heavy and intoxicating. Antonio had never spoken these words aloud, had never acknowledged the way voices reached him from corners where no living soul could stand, the way his brush seemed guided by hands other than his own. To name it would make it real. To claim it would make him dangerous. "What do you want from me?" he asked the Virgin, whose face was becoming more familiar with each passing hour. "Finish what she began. Paint the door she opened. Let them see what lies beyond the veil." Antonio looked down at his hands, at the permanent stains that marked him as surely as any brand. For 3 years he had painted what others commanded, saints in approved poses, miracles rendered safe and distant. But this Virgin demanded something different. She asked him to paint truth, even if truth burned. "They will call it heretical," he said. They called her heretical too, but the saints still answer when her name is spoken in prayer. When Antonio climbed down from the scaffolding that night, he left his brushes arranged on the platform like an offering, their handles pointing toward the unfinished face that watched him go, with eyes that seemed to hold all the sorrow and hope of the world. He walked through the empty streets of Florence with the feeling that he was being followed, not by human footsteps, but by something that moved between the shadows, keeping pace with his hurried steps. His quarters above the workshop felt smaller than usual, the walls pressing closer as if the building itself had shifted in his absence. He sat on the edge of his narrow bed and stared at his hands, at the way the paint had worked itself so deeply into his skin that it seemed to pulse with its own light in the darkness. Outside his window, the city slept fitfully, plagued by dreams of drought and distant war. But Antonio remained awake, listening to voices that seemed to rise from the very stones of the cathedral, calling his name in harmonies that no earthly choir could achieve. Master Lorenzo found him the next morning, standing before the fresco with his arms at his sides, his face turned upward toward the Virgin's incomplete visage. The morning light streaming through the high windows painted both Antonio and his creation in shades of gold that seemed to pulse with their own inner fire. "You worked through the night again," the master said, though his voice carried less disapproval than usual. He stepped closer to examine the progress, and Antonio heard his sharp intake of breath. Her face, it's different, Antonio finished, though he kept his eyes fixed on the painted figure above them. It's impossible, Master Lorenzo whispered. The way the light falls on her features, it changes as the sun moves. I've been painting for 30 years, boy, and I've never seen pigment that responds to natural light like this. Antonio said nothing. He had used no special techniques, no secret formulas passed down through generations of masters. He had simply painted what he saw when he looked at the Virgin's face in his mind, not the sanitized version of divinity that adorned 1,000 other frescoes, but the raw, complex beauty of a soul caught between worlds, bearing the weight of humanity's sins and hopes with equal grace. The church officials come tomorrow, Master Lorenzo continued, his voice tight with anxiety. Cardinal Toretti himself will inspect the work. Everything must be perfect. Everything must be, he paused, searching for the right word, orthodox. Antonio finally looked down at his master, seeing for the first time the fear that lived behind the man's practiced authority. Lorenzo Benedetti had built his reputation on delivering exactly what the church expected: beautiful, inspiring, but ultimately safe representations of divine mystery. This fresco threatened to shatter that reputation, to reveal truths that were meant to remain hidden behind veils of acceptable symbolism. "I can finish it tonight," Antonio said quietly. "Can you?" Master Lorenzo stepped closer, his voice dropping to barely more than a whisper. "Can you paint her as they expect to see her? Can you make her safe?" Antonio looked up at the Virgin's face, at eyes that seemed to hold conversations with invisible saints, at lips that appeared ready to speak prophecies that would reshape the world. To paint over her now, to force her into the mold of conventional piety, would be like burying his grandmother a second time. "I can finish what needs to be finished," he said instead, and Master Lorenzo's shoulders sagged with relief that was perhaps premature. That evening, as the sun painted the cathedral walls in shades of amber and gold, Antonio climbed the scaffolding for what he somehow knew would be the final time. His brushes waited where he had left them, their bristles clean and ready. Below him, the cathedral had filled with an unusual number of evening worshippers, pilgrims who had heard whispers of miracles, citizens drawn by curiosity, clergy members who watched the proceedings with expressions of careful neutrality. Antonio began with the Virgin's hair, adding the final strands that would frame her face in waves of brown so deep they seemed to hold their own shadows. Each stroke felt like a prayer, each curve like a conversation with the divine. As he worked, he became aware of a presence beside him on the scaffold, not visible but undeniably there, guiding his hand with the certainty of shared purpose. "Are you here, Nonna?" he whispered to the empty air. The response came not in words, but in the sudden warming of his paint, in the way the colors seemed to glow from within, as if lit by some inner fire. His grandmother's presence wrapped around him like a familiar shawl, bringing with it the scent of lavender and charcoal, the memory of hands that had taught him to see beyond the surface of things. As the hours passed, Antonio lost himself in the rhythm of creation, in the dance between vision and technique that had become as natural to him as breathing. The Virgin's face emerged beneath his brush with features that belonged fully neither to heaven nor earth, but to that liminal space where the divine and human met and recognized each other as family. Her eyes held depths that seemed to reflect the souls of everyone who looked upon her, offering them not judgment but understanding. Her mouth curved in an expression that was neither smile nor frown, but something more complex, the look of a mother who had watched her children stumble and fall and rise again, who knew their capacity for both cruelty and grace. When the cathedral bells struck midnight, Antonio stepped back from the completed fresco and felt something inside his chest break open like a flower blooming in reverse. The Virgin's face was finished, but it was not what Cardinal Toretti would expect to see. It was not what the Church had commissioned. It was truth, rendered in pigment and prayer, and it would either save souls or damn the one who had dared to paint it. The presence beside him on the scaffold grew stronger, more distinct. When Antonio turned, he could almost see her. His grandmother's weathered face, her eyes bright with pride and sorrow in equal measure. "It is done," she said, though her voice seemed to come from the painted Virgin's lips. "What happens now?" Antonio asked, though he already knew the answer in his bones. "Now you choose." You can climb down from this scaffold and face whatever comes. You can let them decide what your truth is worth. Or you can come with me. Step through the door you have painted. Leave behind the brushes and the masters and the fear. Become what you were always meant to be. Antonio looked down at the cathedral floor, at the scattered worshippers who had begun to notice something different about the fresco, their faces turned upward with expressions of wonder and fear. He looked at his hands, stained blue with the color of divine sorrow, marked forever by the work he had chosen to do. Then he looked at the Virgin's face, at eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. In those painted depths, he saw himself as he truly was, not an apprentice, not a servant to earthly masters, but a bridge between worlds, a translator of divine languages. The realization should have terrified him. Instead, it felt like coming home. "They will say I abandoned my responsibilities," he said to his grandmother's presence. "They will say many things, but the truth you have painted will remain long after their words have been forgotten." Antonio set down his brush for the final time, laying it gently on the wooden platform, like an offering on an altar. The bristles were still wet with the last touches of the Virgin's skin, still holding the color that had brought divine flesh to life on cold plaster. As he stepped back from the painting, he felt the scaffolding begin to shift beneath his feet, not collapsing, but transforming, becoming something more than wood and rope and earthly construction. The air around him shimmered like heat rising from summer stones, and suddenly the boundary between the painted world and the physical one began to blur. The Virgin's face seemed to lean forward from the wall, her painted hands reaching toward him with fingers that cast real shadows in the candlelight. Behind her, the celestial clouds Antonio had painted began to move, swirling with winds that came from no earthly source. "Come," the Virgin said, and her voice was his grandmother's voice and his own voice, and the voice of every soul who had ever dared to paint truth in a world that preferred comfortable lies. "Come home." Antonio looked one last time at the cathedral below, at the people who had begun to gather in greater numbers, drawn by something they could not name but could not resist. Some wept as they stared up at the fresco, tears streaming down their faces as they recognized something in the Virgin's expression that spoke to their deepest wounds and highest hopes. Others fell to their knees, overwhelmed by the presence that seemed to emanate from the painted figure like light from a flame. Master Lorenzo pushed through the crowd, his face pale with terror and wonder in equal measure. He called Antonio's name, but his voice seemed to come from very far away, as if filtered through water or dreams. The scaffolding continued its impossible transformation, becoming something that belonged more to vision than to architecture. Antonio stepped forward, toward the painted clouds that no longer seemed quite so painted, toward the Virgin's outstretched hands that had somehow gained substance and warmth. As his foot left the wooden platform, he felt himself caught between worlds, no longer fully present in the cathedral, but not yet arrived at his destination. He hung suspended in that liminal space, feeling his physical form become lighter, more translucent, as if he were becoming paint himself. Below him, the gathered crowd's voices rose in a mixture of prayer and amazement. Some called out warnings, begging him to climb down safely. Others seemed to understand that they were witnessing something beyond the scope of earthly safety, something that belonged to the realm of miracles and mysteries that could not be explained or controlled. The painted Virgin's face seemed to grow larger as Antonio moved toward it, her features becoming more distinct and more familiar with each impossible step. In her eyes, he saw reflections of every painting he had ever created, every prayer he had ever whispered, every moment when he had felt the divine presence moving through his hands. In her expression, he recognized the face he had been trying to paint his entire life, not the Virgin of church doctrine, but the Divine Mother who embraced both saints and sinners, who wept for the world's pain and rejoiced in its beauty. "You painted me as I truly am," she said, though her painted lips did not move. "Not as they want me to be, but as I choose to be. The mother of all souls, not just the perfect ones." As Antonio reached toward her outstretched hand, he felt his fingers begin to change, taking on the consistency of paint while retaining the warmth of living flesh. The transformation was neither painful nor frightening. It felt like a homecoming, like stepping into clothes that had been made specifically for him before he was born. The last thing he heard from the world below was Master Lorenzo's voice, raised in a mixture of grief and awe. "He has become part of the painting. God preserve us, the boy has become part of the painting." But Antonio was already beyond the reach of earthly preservation. He had stepped through the door his grandmother had opened decades ago, the door that existed in the space between pigment and prayer, between vision and reality. As his hand touched the Virgin's painted fingers, he felt himself dissolve into light and color, becoming one with the truth he had dared to render visible. The fresco in Santa Maria del Carmen was discovered the next morning, apparently complete but somehow changed. Where Antonio should have been standing on the scaffolding, there was only empty air and a set of brushes arranged like flowers on an altar. But Antonio was already beyond the reach of earthly preservation. He had stepped through the door his grandmother had opened decades ago, the door that existed in the space between pigment and prayer, between vision and reality. As his hand touched the Virgin's painted fingers, he felt himself dissolve into light and color, becoming one with the truth he had dared to render visible. The fresco in Santa Maria del Carmen was discovered the next morning, apparently complete but somehow changed. Where Antonio should have been standing on the scaffolding, there was only empty air and a set of brushes arranged like flowers on an altar. His physical form had vanished as completely as if he had never existed, leaving behind only his paint-stained clothes and the impossible masterpiece that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. Cardinal Torretti arrived as scheduled, accompanied by a retinue of church officials whose task it was to examine the work for any trace of heresy or impropriety. But when they looked up at the Virgin's face, they found themselves struck silent by an unspeakable beauty that transcended orthodox categories. Her expression contained multitudes, maternal compassion and divine authority, earthly sorrow and celestial joy, the tenderness of Mary and the terrible mercy of justice itself. More disturbing to the church authorities was the figure that had appeared beside the Virgin, a young man with paint-stained hands raised in a gesture of offering, his face turned toward the Divine Mother with an expression of absolute surrender. Where this figure had come from, no one could say. Master Lorenzo swore he had not painted it, and no earthly painter could have achieved the luminous quality that seemed to emanate from the mysterious apprentice's painted form. "It is as if he stepped into the fresco itself," Cardinal Toretti murmured, though he immediately crossed himself for voicing such an impossible thought. The investigation that followed yielded no satisfactory answers. Antonio Fieramosca had simply vanished, leaving behind a mystery that the church chose to handle through careful silence rather than public inquiry. The fresco was deemed acceptable for public display, though certain officials privately noted that the Virgin's expression seemed to change subtly depending on who was looking at her and what burdens they carried in their hearts. Pilgrims began arriving within days, drawn by stories that spread through Florence like ripples on still water. They came seeking miracles, healing, absolution for sins that had long festered in the darkness of their souls. Many reported visions while praying before the fresco. Glimpses of the young painter working beside the Virgin, his hands moving in gestures of blessing and comfort. Some claimed to hear voices singing in harmonies that seemed to rise from the painted clouds themselves. Master Lorenzo lived for 15 more years, but he never took another apprentice. He would tell visitors that no student could compare to the boy who had learned to paint with light itself, who had mastered techniques that belonged more to angels than to men. In his private moments, when the workshop was empty and the shadows grew long, he would stand before his own smaller works and whisper prayers for forgiveness, knowing that he had been witness to something sacred and had been too frightened to protect it. The brushes Antonio had left behind were never used again. Master Lorenzo preserved them like relics, each one wrapped in silk and kept in a wooden box that he opened only on feast days and holy occasions. Sometimes, in the right light, the bristles still seemed to hold traces of the impossible colors Antonio had mixed. Blues deeper than the Mediterranean sky, golds brighter than the Tuscan sun, reds that pulsed with the rhythm of divine love. Years passed, and the story of the vanishing apprentice became part of Florence's whispered folklore. Mothers told their children about the boy who had painted himself into heaven. Artists spoke in reverent tones about the young master who had chosen divine service over earthly success. The church neither confirmed nor denied the rumors, maintaining the official position that Antonio Fieramosca had simply abandoned his duties and left the city, though no record of his departure or destination was ever found. But those who spent long hours in prayer before the fresco knew better. They could see him there, painted into the celestial landscape he had created, working eternally beside the Virgin who bore his grandmother's face and spoke with voices that came from beyond the veil. In their dreams, they heard him singing hymns in harmonies that made their hearts ache with longing for home. The miracle healings began 6 months after Antonio's disappearance. A merchant's daughter, born deaf, knelt before the fresco and rose with perfect hearing. A soldier, maimed in the wars against Austria, found his withered arm restored after a night spent sleeping on the cathedral floor. Word spread through Italy and beyond, drawing pilgrims from across Europe who came seeking the intervention of the Virgin whose painted eyes seemed to see into their souls. Church authorities investigated each reported miracle with methodical skepticism, but the evidence proved overwhelming. Medical examinations confirmed healings that had no natural explanation. Witnesses testified to visions of the young painter appearing beside sufferers in their darkest hours, his hands glowing with the same light that seemed to emanate from the fresco itself. The Bishop of Florence, faced with mounting evidence of divine intervention, finally declared the fresco to be a site of authentic miraculous activity. But he also issued strict guidelines for pilgrimage and prayer, concerned that the unorthodox elements of the painting might encourage dangerous mystical interpretations. The Virgin's face, with its complex blend of sorrow and joy, its refusal to conform to traditional iconographic standards, remained a source of theological discomfort even as it drew ever-growing crowds of the faithful. 20 years after Antonio's disappearance, a young woman named Caterina Benedetti, Master Lorenzo's niece, came to pray before the fresco. She had been born with a gift similar to Antonio's, an ability to see beyond the surface of things that had brought her both wonder and persecution. As she knelt before the painted Virgin, she felt a presence beside her, warm, familiar, tinged with the scent of lapis lazuli and prayer. "You have his eyes," a voice whispered, though when Caterina turned, she saw only empty air. That night, she dreamed of a workshop filled with impossible light, where a young man with paint-stained hands taught her to mix colors that did not exist in the earthly palette. When she woke, her own hands bore traces of blue pigment, though she had touched nothing but her prayer beads and the cold stone floor of the cathedral. Caterina became a painter, though she told no one of her nocturnal lessons or the voice that guided her brush through techniques that belonged to no earthly school. Her work was different from anything produced in the studios of Florence, too luminous for conventional taste, too honest for comfortable piety. But those who looked upon her paintings found themselves confronted with truths they had not known they carried, with longings they had not dared to name. She painted until she was 73 years old, creating works that seemed to glow from within, portraits that captured not just physical likeness, but the secret geography of souls. And when she died, her body was found in her studio, slumped over a canvas that showed the interior of a heavenly workshop, where figures with paint-stained hands worked eternally on masterpieces that would never be seen by earthly eyes. The painting was never finished, but those who saw it before the church officials had it removed claimed that one of the figures in the celestial studio bore a striking resemblance to a young man whose face could be glimpsed in the clouds of the Santa Maria del Carmine fresco, if one knew how to look, if one's eyes had been trained to see beyond the veil of ordinary sight. Centuries passed, and the story of Antonio Fieramosca evolved into legend, then into myth, then into something deeper than history, a truth that lived in the space between painted surface and divine mystery. The fresco endured through wars and renovations, its colors growing more luminous with age rather than fading, its power to heal and transform remaining undiminished by the passage of time. Art historians puzzled over the techniques used in the painting, unable to replicate the way light seemed to move within the pigments, the way the Virgin's expression appeared to respond to the emotional state of each viewer. Chemical analysis revealed nothing unusual about the materials, standard tempera and fresco techniques, pigments that could be found in any master's workshop. Yet the finished work possessed qualities that defied scientific explanation. Modern pilgrims still came, drawn by stories passed down through generations of the faithful. They knelt before the fresco and whispered prayers in dozens of languages, seeking healing for afflictions both physical and spiritual. Many reported the same experience, a sense of being seen and understood by eyes that held infinite compassion, a feeling of hands blessed with divine skill reaching out to touch their wounds with healing light. The gift of seeing beyond the veil still surfaced occasionally in the bloodlines of Florence, manifesting in children who painted impossible colors and spoke to saints as easily as they spoke to their playmates. These young artists inevitably found their way to the Santa Maria del Carmine fresco, drawn by an inheritance they could not name but could not resist. They would stand before the painting for hours, their young faces bright with recognition, their hands moving in unconscious mimicry of brushstrokes they had learned in dreams. Some became painters themselves, adding their own small contributions to the secret tradition that had begun with Antonio's grandmother and continued through her grandson's impossible transformation. They painted with techniques that no earthly master could teach, guided by hands that reached across the boundary between the visible and invisible worlds. Their work was treasured by those who could see its true value, though it often disturbed viewers who preferred their art to remain safely within the bounds of conventional understanding. The workshop above Master Lorenzo's old studio became a pilgrimage site in its own right, though the church never officially recognized its significance. Visitors reported hearing the sound of brushes against canvas late at night, the whisper of prayers spoken in dialects that had been dead for centuries, the soft laughter of artists who had found perfect freedom in divine service. And sometimes, in the hour between midnight and dawn, when the cathedral lay wrapped in darkness and dreams, those who prayed before the fresco claimed to see movement within the painted clouds, figures appearing and disappearing like thoughts half-remembered, hands raised in blessing or invitation, faces that bore the luminous joy of souls who had found their true calling. The Virgin's painted eyes continued to weep real tears on certain feast days, though the Church had long since stopped trying to provide scientific explanations for the phenomenon. The tears were collected in crystal vessels and distributed to pilgrims as relics, though they seemed to possess no power beyond the faith of those who carried them. The true miracle lay not in the tears themselves, but in the painting's ability to awaken in viewers a recognition of their own capacity for divine love and sacrificial beauty. As dawn broke over Florence on a morning in early spring, 300 years after Antonio Fieramosca had climbed his final scaffold, a young priest named Father Marcello knelt before the fresco to offer his morning prayers. He had recently arrived from Rome, assigned to study the phenomenon of miraculous art and its impact on popular devotion. His academic training had prepared him to approach such matters with scholarly skepticism, to separate authentic spiritual experience from collective delusion and wishful thinking. But as he looked up at the Virgin's face, he felt something shift inside his chest, a recognition that bypassed his intellect and spoke directly to parts of his soul he had forgotten existed. In the painted eyes, he saw reflected not the sanitized piety of seminary instruction, but the raw, complex beauty of divine love as it actually existed in the world, tender and terrible, healing and transforming, refusing to be contained within the safe boundaries of orthodox interpretation. For a moment that stretched beyond measurable time, Father Marcello found himself looking through the Virgin's eyes rather than at them, seeing the cathedral and its gathered faithful from a perspective that encompassed both their surface appearance and their hidden spiritual reality. He saw the layers of prayer and longing that had accumulated around the fresco like invisible sediment, the countless souls who had knelt where he now knelt and poured out their hearts before this impossible image. And in the painted clouds that surrounded the Virgin's ascending form, he caught a glimpse of figures he had been trained to dismiss as imaginative projection, artists with paint-stained hands, saints whose faces bore the marks of earthly suffering, angels whose wings seemed to flutter with the rhythm of eternal breath. Among them, barely visible unless one knew how to look, he saw a young man whose expression held all the joy and sorrow of someone who had chosen truth over safety, divine service over earthly success. When Father Marcello finally rose from his knees, his academic skepticism had not disappeared, but it had been tempered by something deeper, a recognition that mystery was not the enemy of faith, but its truest expression. He would write his report for the Vatican, documenting the continued claims of miraculous healing and supernatural phenomenon associated with the fresco. But he would also include observations that his superiors would find troubling, notes about the painting's ability to reveal spiritual truths that could not be captured in theological formulas, its power to awaken in viewers a hunger for divine beauty that no earthly satisfaction could fulfill. The bells of Santa Maria del Carmine began to ring the hour. their bronze voices carrying across the awakening city like prayers made audible. As their echoes faded into the morning air, Father Marcello thought he heard another sound, fainter than the bells, but somehow more present, like brushes moving against canvas in steady, purposeful strokes. When he turned toward the sound, he saw nothing but shadows and stone. But the feeling remained with him as he walked away from the fresco, a sense that somewhere beyond the reach of earthly sight, the work continued. In the painted heaven that Antonio Faramasca had entered 3 centuries before, time moved differently than it did in the world of flesh and stone. Moments stretched into eternities, and eternities condensed into single heartbeats of pure creative joy. The young painter worked alongside masters whose names had been whispered in prayers for 1,000 years, learning techniques that belonged to the secret grammar of divine love. His hands, no longer limited by the constraints of earthly pigment, painted with light itself, sculpting visions from the raw material of hope and faith, creating works that existed only in the space between prayer and fulfillment. The colors he used had no names in human languages, though they corresponded perfectly to the hidden spectrums of spiritual experience. The precise shade of a soul's recognition of grace, the exact hue of forgiveness finally accepted, the luminous transparency of love that had been tested by suffering and emerged unbroken. Sometimes his work brought him close to the boundary between worlds, close enough to touch the lives of those who prayed before the fresco he had painted in his final moments of earthly existence. Through the Virgin's painted eyes, he watched centuries of pilgrims kneel and rise, carrying away pieces of the mystery he had tried to capture in pigment and prayer. He saw children born with gifts like his own, young artists who painted impossible colors and spoke to saints with the casual familiarity of conversation between friends. Each of these encounters filled him with a joy that had no earthly equivalent, the satisfaction of work that served its intended purpose, of truth successfully transmitted across the seemingly impermeable barrier between the visible and invisible worlds. He had become what his grandmother had always known he could be, a bridge between realms, a translator of divine languages, a painter of doors that opened onto infinite landscapes of spiritual possibility. In the eternal workshop where he now labored, Antonio understood that his disappearance from the world had not been an ending, but a transformation, not an abandonment of responsibility, but the acceptance of a higher calling. The brushes he had left behind on that final scaffold had been symbols, not tools, markers of a transition that could not be measured in earthly terms. And in the cathedral of Santa Maria del Carmine, as morning light streamed through ancient windows and painted the stone floor in patterns of gold and amber, the fresco continued its patient work of revelation. The Virgin's face gazed down at another day's gathering of the faithful, her painted eyes holding depths that had been mixed from truth and prayer, her expression offering to each viewer exactly what their soul most needed to see: judgment or mercy, challenge or comfort, the face of divine love as it appeared when filtered through the infinite variations of human need. The miracle was not that Antonio Faramasca had vanished into his own creation, but that he had found a way to remain, not as memory or legend, but as living presence, continuing his work in a medium that transcended the limitations of pigment and canvas. In the space between the painted surface and the viewer's heart, he painted still, using colors that existed only in the secret palette of divine grace, creating works that could not be seen with earthly eyes, but could be felt in the deeper chambers of the soul. The bells fell silent, their bronze voices fading into the growing warmth of the spring morning. In that silence, those who knew how to listen could hear the whisper of brushes against eternal canvas, the soft exhalation of artists who had found perfect freedom in divine service, the quiet laughter of souls who had discovered that the most beautiful paintings were those that could never be finished, only lived.